The fan wasn't working. Heat clung to the canvas walls like wet cloth. In a dim field hospital tent somewhere on Luzon, August of 1945, two Japanese women in tattered uniforms stood frozen beside a cot. The American sergeant's voice was flat, more exhaustion than authority. "You'll share this bed with us tonight." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the flies seemed to stop. To the women, Imperial Army nurses captured just days earlier, the words hit like a shell blast. Share this bed. Their minds went straight to the worst. Every story they'd been told about Americans ended in screams. They had sworn oaths to die before dishonor, yet here they were, alive, ordered to lie beside the enemy. One of them, barely 20, whispered, "Better to die," but the guard outside just shrugged. There were no spare cots, no spare tents, just heat, sickness, and sleep. As night pressed in, the Americans dropped their rifles and boots, too weary to notice the cultural earthquake they'd caused. One medic, his face sunken from malaria, collapsed first, his arm dangling off the cot. The women tensed. Then nothing, no touch, no words, only the heavy breathing of men who'd seen too much. Outside, rain began to hiss on tarpaulin roofs. Inside, shame and confusion battled in silence. The younger nurse felt her throat tighten with fear and disbelief. Why weren't they doing what they were supposed to do? Why weren't they proving the propaganda right? In her homeland, surrender meant unending disgrace. Here, the enemy simply snored beside her. Reports estimate more than 4,000 Japanese women were captured across Southeast Asia that year. Most were nurses, clerks, or auxiliaries, not fighters. For them, captivity wasn't just loss, it was social death. But something unexpected was happening in that tent. Hours later, the older nurse realized her trembling had stopped. She could hear one American muttering in his sleep something about home, cornfields, and a name she couldn't catch. She turned her face toward the canvas ceiling, eyes open, realizing the war hadn't just taken nations. It was unraveling everything she'd been taught about mercy and monsters. And when morning light bled through the seams of the tent, she knew the bed wasn't just wood and fabric anymore. It was a question, the kind that would haunt her through every sunrise after this one. Dawn crawled into the tent, pale and sticky. The women still hadn't moved much. The Americans were gone, off to their duties, but the cot stayed warm with leftover body heat. For the first time since their capture, the silence wasn't filled with shouting or orders, just breathing. The younger nurse blinked hard, trying to remember who she was before all this. Weeks earlier, in the jungles of Luzon, they had been called Angels of the Empire. Their task was to tend to wounded soldiers of the Imperial Army, young men bleeding out under slogans of eternal victory. When the U.S. counterattack swept through in mid-1945, their hospital unit crumbled. Out of nearly 200 personnel, only a handful survived. When surrender came, the nurses were shaking, some still clutching scalpels as if they could fight off tanks. American soldiers found them hiding beneath banana leaves, uniforms shredded, faces caked with mud. They expected execution. Instead, they were given water. The contradiction was unbearable. The Empire had trained them under the Bushido Code, death before capture. To live was treason, to be touched by the enemy unthinkable. One whispered, "Americans kill all prisoners." But they didn't. By mid-1945, U.S. field reports showed Japanese surrenders had increased nearly sixfold compared to earlier in the war. The myth of the invincible soldier was breaking down. Still, the women didn't know whether survival was mercy or punishment. Inside the camp, they were separated from male POW, but not always from danger. Rumors spread. Some women vanished in chaotic transfers, others ended up in field hospitals like this one. Here, the line between patient and prisoner blurred. Fever didn't respect uniforms. That night's order to share a bed wasn't cruelty. It was logistics. There were too few cots, too many bodies, too little energy left to care about etiquette. Yet, for these women, it was the shattering of everything they'd been raised to believe about purity, duty, and shame. As the older nurse folded the blanket, she noticed the tag stitched into its corner, U.S. Army Medical Department. The same men who had bombed their cities were now the ones preventing them from freezing in tropical rain. She couldn't decide if that made them monsters, or something even more dangerous, human, and as night approached again, the confusion would only deepen. Night returned with the same heavy air thick, still, buzzing with insects. The tent was half dark, except for the faint glow of a kerosene lamp. The two Japanese nurses sat stiffly at the edge of the cot, waiting for what they were sure would come. Every instinct screamed run, but where could they go? Beyond the tent lay mud, wire, and rifles. Inside, the Americans were already unbuckling belts and collapsing from exhaustion. The younger nurse's fingers trembled as she gripped her rosary. Bead substitute, 2 safety pins tied with thread. She whispered, "It will happen now." But it didn't. One soldier, too sick to care, dropped beside them, boots still on, his breath ragged. Another leaned against the tent pole and passed out upright. The nurses waited, bodies rigid. Minutes turned to hours. Then they realized something almost insulting. The Americans didn't even see them as women tonight. Just more bodies on a crowded floor. By dawn, the cot had become a no man's land, no touch, no violation, just mutual survival. The bed wasn't a weapon. It was a ceasefire. The older nurse studied the medic's hands, cracked and dirty but careful even in sleep. How could the same hands bandage wounds by day and kill by night? The tent reeked of disinfectant and sweat. Temperatures hovered around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Malaria patients groaned nearby. Ration crates doubled as pillows. 12 cots for 30 soldiers. Logistics didn't care about shame. The Americans had learned to sleep anywhere: foxholes, trucks, broken barracks. To them, this was just another night. But to the captured nurses, it was identity collapse. "We thought they'd defile us," one later recalled, "but they only snored beside us." It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was fatigue so deep it turned into neutrality. Yet neutrality itself felt like mercy. Outside, guards changed shifts, boots squelching in mud. The women stayed awake, confused, alert, watching the tent breathe with every gust of wind. The younger one realized that her fear was now mixing with curiosity. What kind of enemy sleeps without guarding his weapon? As the first light hit the medic's face, she caught herself feeling something forbidden relief, and that small crack of safety was about to open into something she never expected, a moment of care. The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. It drummed on the canvas like endless gunfire, seeping through seams, pooling beneath the cots. Fever had taken hold of the younger nurse, her lips pale, pulse faint. The older one knelt beside her, unsure whether to ask for help or let fate decide. That's when a shadow crossed the tent flap. An American medic, 20, something, mud to his knees, holding a dented canteen. He didn't speak Japanese. She didn't understand English. But he could see her fear, and she could see his exhaustion. Slowly, he lifted the canteen, gesturing for her to drink. She hesitated. Every instinct warned her it was a trick. But thirst was stronger than pride. The first sip burned like life itself. The medic nodded once, then pulled a wool blanket from his pack and draped it over both women. "Share it," he muttered, walking away. That small gesture, so ordinary to him, felt seismic to them. The wool smelled of sweat and disinfectant, yet it carried something impossible to name: safety. The American soldiers had 1 quart of water per person each day. The POW were allotted half that. Disease had cut through both sides: malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, turning enemies into equals under the same fever. The younger nurse coughed, whispering, "Why?" The older one had no answer. Maybe pity, maybe protocol, maybe humanity. Reports from that time show infection rates in frontline field camps exceeding 40%. Medical orderlies often worked through nights without morphine or rest, improvising bandages from torn shirts. One of those shirts now wrapped around the nurse's wrist, a name tag still visible: O'Hara J. Hours passed. The rain softened. The older nurse noticed the medic sleeping a few feet away, rifle out of reach. She realized something that unsettled her deeply. He trusted them. The Empire had preached that Western men saw them as less than human. Yet here he was, asleep in their presence, unguarded. When morning came, the younger nurse's fever broke. The blanket stayed. So did the silence. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first night they didn't dream of dying. The bed was no longer an insult. It was survival, shared under the same storm. And soon, that survival would challenge everything they believed about their own nation's honor. By the fourth morning, something impossible had settled into the air routine. The Japanese nurses were now being fed on schedule: a scoop of rice, a sliver of canned meat, sometimes even powdered milk. They ate in silence, side by side with the very men they had been told were beasts. The younger one couldn't stop staring at the soap bar the Americans handed her. She hadn't touched real soap since 1944. Back home, Japanese officers had slapped them for asking for food before their male comrades. "A soldier eats first," they'd said. Hunger was discipline, pain was patriotism. Yet here, the enemy gave them medicine first, food second, and dignity without asking. That alone tore through years of indoctrination faster than any bomb. Every evening, the medic named O'Hara walked through the tent counting heads, checking pulses, scribbling notes. His supplies seemed endless: gauze, disinfectant, even clean bandages every day. The nurses whispered among themselves, "How do they never run out?" They didn't know it yet, but U.S. logistics were an empire of their own. The calorie allotment for POW hovered between 2,000 and 2,500 per day, double what most imperial soldiers received. It wasn't generosity, it was policy. The women began comparing it quietly to their past. One recalled an officer back in Manchuria who broke her ribs for fainting on duty. Another remembered sleeping in snow without blankets. Now, an enemy medic offered her aspirin for a headache. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to make sense. Better than by our own. One murmured, eyes on the steaming ration tin. It wasn't said with gratitude, it was disbelief. The war had turned morality inside out. The tent smelled of boiled rice and damp canvas. For the first time, laughter crept in, soft, uneasy, human. A sergeant cracked a joke the women couldn't understand, but his tone wasn't cruel. The nurses smiled awkwardly. For one fleeting second, the word enemy didn't fit anyone inside that tent. Outside, thunder rolled over Luzon's hills. Inside, something gentler took its place. A fragile understanding that maybe survival didn't have to feel like betrayal. But with that realization came something heavier: guilt. And guilt, they would soon learn, can keep you awake longer than fear ever could. Night again, the kind that presses down on your chest like a weight. Inside the tent, everyone breathed in rhythm, one vast lung of exhaustion. The younger nurse lay awake, eyes open to the flicker of the oil lamp. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was remembering faces, names, the men she'd tried to save when her hospital collapsed under mortar fire. 70% of her unit had died before capture. Her closest friend had chosen to step into a grenade rather than surrender. Now here she was, alive, under a blanket that smelled faintly of American tobacco. Mercy felt heavier than shame. She turned her head toward the cot beside her, O'Hara. The medic was asleep, one arm across his eyes. His chest rose and fell in slow, weary rhythm. She noticed his scars, not from whips or punishment, but from work burns, knife nicks, life lived too close to other people's pain. He'd handed her water earlier without hesitation, then stitched a stranger's wound with the same hands that might have loaded a rifle days before. Why didn't they avenge them? She whispered, meaning her fallen comrades. The question dissolved into the humid air. Maybe they were too tired to hate. Maybe mercy was their rebellion. Outside, rain turned the camp into a swamp. Somewhere, a generator sputtered. The nurses could hear the faint hum of trucks arriving, supply convoys that never seemed to stop. Compared to the emptiness of their own empire's logistics, this abundance felt like sorcery. The younger nurse closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the prayer faltered halfway. She no longer knew who deserved forgiveness. She only knew she was alive because her enemy had chosen not to see her as one. Sleep crept in slow, reluctant waves. Between dreams, she saw the faces of her friends and the ghosts of men who'd died whispering, "Tenno, Haika Bands, I." But in this tent, that war cry sounded meaningless. The Empire had promised them honor through death. Yet this stranger's kindness was showing her a different kind of survival, one rooted not in flags, but in small, unspoken mercies. And when morning came, she would find proof that mercy wasn't a fluke. It was infrastructure. The next morning broke with the rumble of engines. The nurses stepped outside the tent for the first time in days and froze. Convoys, rows of them, rolled through the muddy clearing, trucks stacked high with crates stamped U.S. Army Chicago. The air reeked of diesel, rubber, and roasted coffee. Every hour, new supplies arrived. Cigarettes, medicine, boots, chocolate, gasoline. It was as if the Americans had built an entire city out of abundance. For women raised on scarcity, it felt like another planet. They remembered rationing back home, scraping rice from the bottom of pots, boiling weeds for soup, sewing uniforms from curtains. The Empire's radio had told them that America was decadent and weak. Yet here they stood, watching men unload food faster than their army had ever moved bullets. Reports from that year describe over 16 million tons of American supplies shipped across the Pacific. The nurses didn't know the number, but they could see its weight in motion, jeeps buzzing, cranes clanking, barrels rolling. Even the smell of the fuel felt like power. One whispered, "Their war runs on wheels." The older nurse realized something unsettling. The Americans didn't look victorious. They looked efficient. Their strength came from systems, not speeches. She thought about the hollow promises of the Imperial Command, the ones that starved her unit while factories burned in Osaka. Here, every soldier seemed fed, every wound tended. O'Hara, the medic, was writing in his logbook. He caught their stares and grinned. "Resupply day," he said casually, wiping sweat off his brow. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the rhythm. Relief. This wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. That night, the truck's echo still vibrated through the jungle. The younger nurse whispered, "They can't lose." Not because of guns, but because of everything behind them. The farms, factories, fuel lines stretching across oceans. For the first time, she realized the war was over long before Japan surrendered. In the glow of a lantern, she watched a mechanic grease a Jeep axle and thought, "This is victory. mundane, methodical, unstoppable. And as she looked back at O'Hara adjusting the medical crate labels, she knew this machine of mercy had changed the world's math forever. But mercy, once seen, demanded a price she wasn't ready to pay. That evening, as the convoys faded into the jungle horizon, the medic named O'Hara sat on an overturned ammo crate, rolling a cigarette with trembling fingers. The rain had finally stopped. The nurses watched him from the tent doorway. This young man with mud, caked boots, and eyes too old for his age. Without warning, he spoke. His English was soft, slow, like someone confessing to the dark. "My brother," he said, tapping the side of his helmet, "died at Saipan." The women didn't understand the words, but his tone carried the ache. He pointed toward the stars, then mimed an explosion. They nodded, silent. O'Hara forced a crooked smile, exhaled smoke, and held the cigarette out to them. The older nurse hesitated, then took it. It was his last one. In that moment, she saw something unbearable, grief that looked like her own. Reports say over 12,000 American medics died in the Pacific Theater, many unarmed, many refusing to abandon patients under fire. O'Hara was one of the few who'd survived. His body bore the proof, a deep scar along his shoulder, a bullet groove through the calf. He looked nothing like the monsters imperial propaganda had painted. When he stitched a wound, his hands shook not from cruelty, but from memory. He treated even Japanese soldiers without flinching. The nurses began to understand what their officers never could. This man's compassion wasn't weakness. It was rebellion against the war itself. Later that night, they sat beside him as he cleaned instruments under lantern light. The younger nurse handed him a rag, and their fingers brushed. No words, no fear, just the fragile rhythm of people too tired to hate. He grieved like us. She whispered in her language, not knowing he'd feel the weight of it even without translation. When O'Hara stood to leave, he paused by the cot, glancing back once. "Get some rest," he said. She didn't catch the words, but the softness of his voice stayed with her long after he was gone. That night, the camp fell into silence. But something had shifted. War's language had changed from orders to gestures, from violence to care. And by morning, that fragile understanding would lead to something neither side expected: collaboration. By dawn, the line between patient and prisoner had almost vanished. The nurses no longer sat apart, they worked. When O'Hara limped into the tent that morning, he found them already cleaning the surgical table, folding gauze, and boiling instruments in a dented steel pot. No one had ordered them. They just moved instinctively, because doing something felt better than remembering everything. The tent buzzed with low voices and clinking metal. A wounded Marine groaned nearby. His leg was wrapped in rough bandages. Without hesitation, the older nurse stepped forward. She'd done this before: field amputations, blood transfusions, morphine counts scribbled on ration paper. She reached for fresh cloth. O'Hara watched quietly, then handed her a pair of tweezers. For the first time, he said, "Good job." 2 words. No politics, no pity, just recognition. That small nod broke something wide open inside her. It wasn't forgiveness she felt. It was competence rediscovered. The Empire had told her she existed to serve men, to die quietly if captured. But here, her skill mattered again. The young nurse beside her smiled shyly as O'Hara corrected her bandage fold. They understood nothing of each other's language, yet everything of each other's fatigue. Reports from the final months of the war suggest more than 25,000 Japanese POW ended up assisting Allied medics in makeshift hospitals across the Pacific. The war machine was collapsing, but human instinct to heal, to survive wasn't. By midday, the tent smelled like alcohol and boiled canvas. O'Hara scribbled in his notebook, listing his helpers by role. He didn't call them enemy. He wrote assistants, Outside, thunder rolled again, but this time the women didn't flinch. They were too busy saving a stranger's life. The older nurse pressed a bandage to a bleeding chest, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared say in months. O'Hara met her eyes, understanding the gesture if not the words. They trusted our hands, she would later recall. Not because they were Japanese or female, but because, for a few fleeting days, they were just people trying to stop the dying. But every war's mercy comes with an aftershock, and when the fighting finally ended, peace would not feel like freedom. It would feel like exile. The war ended like a door slammed shut, sudden, echoing, final. Word of Japan's surrender reached the camp through a crackling radio in mid-August 1945. Some Americans cheered. Others just sat in silence, too drained to feel victory. The Japanese nurses didn't cheer at all. They simply stared at the horizon, trying to imagine what home even meant now. Weeks later, transport ships carried them back across the Pacific, tired, thinner, changed in ways their families would never understand. When they stepped onto the dock in Yokohama, the city was unrecognizable, rubble, ash, and faces hardened by defeat. The same government that had once called them angels of the empire now called them something else tainted. Their records marked them as returned from enemy territory. That label was enough to poison entire lives. Neighbors whispered, former officers looked away, some women were refused entry into temples, others, branded as defiled, took their own lives. Official surveys from Post, War Japan, revealed that more than 60% of repatriated female POWs never married. They carried invisible wounds, shame imposed by a nation that couldn't accept its own defeat. One of the nurses, older now, bones sharper beneath her skin, kept a single relic from the camp, a faded wool blanket. In its corner, a tag still read U.S. Army Medical Department. She'd folded it neatly into her suitcase, unable to throw it away. That blank, it wasn't comfort anymore. It was contradiction made fabric. Sometimes, when night air turned cold, she would unfold it just to remember that once mercy had come from the other side of the gun. She couldn't talk about it publicly. To do so would mean disgrace. But privately, she'd whisper, America spared us. Japan erased us. Years passed. The empire rebuilt itself into a nation of factories and neon. Yet for these women, the war never really ended. It only changed address, moving from jungles to memories. The younger nurse, now middle-aged, visited a temple one winter evening, praying not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Snow fell like ash over her shoulders. She thought of O'Hara, of the trucks, of the shared bed in Luzon, and wondered if he'd survived. And when her granddaughter once asked, what was the war like, she finally decided to tell the truth. It was decades later, Tokyo, 1987. Neon lights glowed outside the nursing home window, reflections trembling against glass. The war was long over, yet its echoes still lived in the slow rhythm of an old woman's breath. The former POW nurse sat beside her granddaughter, a teenage girl holding a tape recorder for a school project. "Grandma," she asked softly, "what was the war really like?" For a long time, the woman didn't answer. Her hands, thin, veined, steady, rested on her lap. She could still feel the rough wool of that U.S. Army blanket, still smell the disinfectant, still hear the rain on the tent roof in Luzon. She had kept those memories locked away for more than 40 years, afraid of what her own people might say. But time had eroded shame the same way rivers carve stone, slowly, relentlessly. Finally, she whispered, "The enemy taught me humanity." The granddaughter blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. The old nurse told her everything, the order to share a bed, the fever, the blanket, the medic who offered his last cigarette. Her voice trembled but never broke. When she described the night, the Americans slept beside them without touching. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of disbelief at her own survival. "We shared a bed," she said, "and our illusions died there. The tape kept rolling, capturing the sound of a war that had never truly ended, only transformed into memory and mercy." Historians later found testimonies like hers archived by NHK in the late 1980s. Quiet confessions from women once labeled traitors. Each story carried the same paradox: compassion in captivity, kindness from the enemy. The granddaughter, hearing this, looked stunned. "So they weren't monsters?" she asked. The old woman smiled faintly. "No, monsters follow orders, humans choose mercy." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, modern Tokyo's heartbeat echoing a world that once burned. The nurse leaned back, eyes half closed. The war had taken her friends, her youth, her faith in nations, but it had given her one unshakable truth: mercy can be more shocking than war itself. And as the recorder clicked off, her granddaughter reached for her hand. 2 generations connected by a story born from one impossible night, in one overcrowded bed, where enemies became human.